I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Manchester, 1939, a major industrial city situated in the northwest of Great Britain. The world knew then where we were and what we were famous for, the hub of British industry. Along with the Thames, Mersey and Bristol Channel, the Manchester Ship Canal was considered important enough to be earmarked by Hermann Goering as a prime target for the Luftwaffe. Here we were, situated at a time when our cities, towns and villages were destined to fight for their very survival against a determined enemy who was prepared to destroy us all in a war that for the first time in Britain's history would touch the lives of every man, woman and child. This video contains moving and still images of that immense struggle in Manchester, as seen through the lenses of the Manchester Evening News and the National Fire Service. So settle back and let us take you back 60 years to Manchester at war. And so to preparations for war. Before the outbreak of war, the government had put forward schemes for the evacuation of children, expectant mothers and mothers with children under school age. Manchester's evacuation programme was to be spread over 3 days, and around 8,000 children were expected to leave for safer areas such as Macclesfield, Whaley Bridge and Glossop. So successful were Manchester's arrangements that by the time Chamberlain's broadcast to the nation at 11 o'clock, only 9 special trains remained to be dispatched. In all, 72,000 children and 23,000 adults left Manchester. With an ID label round the neck, a gas mask in a cardboard box and a few personal belongings. This advertisement appeared in the Manchester Evening News. What to take? These are what evacuees should have when reporting for transfer to the safe areas. School children, gas mask, change of underclothing, night clothes, house shoes, spare stockings, toothbrush and comb, towel and handkerchiefs, warm coat or mackintosh, and a packet of food sufficient for 24 hours. Babies, 2 vests, 1 pilch, 6 napkins, 1 matinee coat, a pair of leggings, 2 night dresses, a woolen body belt, rainproof for cot, a pair of socks, a shawl, safety pins, soap, towel, sponge, feeder, feeding bottle and gas mask. And this is a baby's gas mask, and the mother had to operate it, the child had to be put in it first, and she had to get air into it by operating the bellows on the side. After World War I, the threat of gas attacks was a major fear in this country. Here we see decontamination squads of Manchester City Council. Here a picture of air raid precautions 1939 in anticipation of gas attack. Regular drills were undertaken in the use of gas masks, and we see 2 young children here with their Mickey Mouse gas masks outside St Joseph's Police Station in Longsight. Manchester held its first test blackout on the 29th of September 1938 in Oxford Street, All Saints and St Peter's Square area. The blackout came into force for real at sunset on the 1st of September 1939 and would last for 2,061 consecutive nights. And here we have 3 specimen photos showing layout of white blackout paint applied to the mudguards and lifeguards of Manchester Corporation buses. Note the blackout masks fitted to both headlamps and the use of only one side light. And this one also shows a bus in wartime camouflage livery of red and battleship grey. And here we have the traveller's nightmare. The threat of invasion was so great that all the signposts were uprooted and taken away. As early as 1938, most towns and cities had practiced air raid alerts. Various types of shelters were around, including trench shelters in parks, the use of existing cellars and vaults. Here we see an original wood-based air raid shelter being erected in Albert Square at the time of the Munich crisis in 1938. Anderson shelters, of course, named after Sir John Anderson, Secretary of State for Home Affairs. These shelters were extremely effective and could survive almost anything except a direct hit. There was one slight problem with early Andersons, that they were too small to sleep in, and more importantly, they were prone to flooding. And here they are making air raid shelters in London Road. And the caption for this photograph says, "All the top lawns and flower beds surrounding the sunken gardens in Piccadilly, Manchester, were dug up yesterday and work began on surface, brick and concrete air raid shelters." Another picture here of surface air raid shelters in Piccadilly Gardens. And this incredible picture here, cut out of solid rock in the caves below Chestergate, Stockport. This ARP shelter will provide accommodation for thousands of people and was opened by the Mayoress, Mrs. T.E. Hunt. It is part of a £22,000 scheme to provide bomb-proof shelters for over 20,000 people.
My name's Vic Barry, I'm one of the guides here. The reason I like doing this job is I was born about a year into the war, 1940. I lived in the 11 Zoom Longsight area of Manchester. I've worked for Stockport or Museum Service since 1992, though I've been working with Stockport since 1980. And I really love my job. Now these shelters were built because of the looming war, but when they were very first started, there was no war or any signs of a war. They were started as a road widening scheme. When they knocked the houses down on this side, they realised all these caves had been hidden, and they thought they may be prehistoric caves, till they went in and realised that the houses had actually extended the properties. They'd made the cells a larder, because inside the shelters, as you'll notice, it's an ambient 12 degrees at all times, ideal for storing stuff. So if you come in here in the summer, it's very cool. You come here in the winter, it feels very warm. The story of the shelters is, as they were doing this road widening scheme, just as they were about to abandon the idea of doing it, the war did come, and they got the idea that it would be an ideal place for women and children to shelter from the war that was about to begin. And this comes obviously from the Spanish Civil War, Guernica, when lots of women and children were killed because there was no place to shelter. Now, the big alteration is they built enough room here for 4,000 people, completed just after the war began, and for the first year of the war, known as the complacency year, that's when I don't remember, but a lot of my friends do, planes going over but nothing actually happening. What they must have been doing was reconnaissance work, because a year later, 1940, Christmas Eve, would you believe, they bombed Manchester city centre and parts of Salford. And that really did bring people to realise how serious this was going to be. Now, Manchester people hadn't heard of Stockport shelters, but they did after the bombing, and what they decided to do was come down here, possibly on a Friday night, and stay till Monday, because they didn't want to keep going backwards and forwards on the tram. So they brought their equipment with them, bedding, you name it, they brought it with them. In fact, they gave this shelters the nickname the Chestergate Hotel. That was due to the fact that you could get about 4,000 people in here, but when the Manchester people come and stayed Friday to Monday, if you were a local person in Stockport, just pottering around the town centre, and there was an air raid, the idea was you came in here and sheltered. Unfortunately, you couldn't get in. It was packed. So this is where the extensions came in a year later. They very quickly added to it and took the complement to about 7,500. As we go around on the tour, you'll see the difference. These were built very quickly, and plenty of room then to put people down here from air raids. Now here we have the warden's post. This would have been here had there been more than 500 people on a site. Well, obviously there was going to be more than 500 here. They were actually opened and built for 4,000, which later, a year into the war, 7,500. So you'd have had a civil defence officer in charge of volunteer wardens, possibly 2 at a time. This is where they slept, because you would have needed somebody to cover at all times, opening and closing the building as necessary. Obviously the things that go with it, the cycle, there's an awful lot of tunnelling. Like I say, if you actually put them all side by side, you've got nearly a mile of tunnels, ideal for him to cycle around on. And when you go around some of the other parts, you'll understand why that cycle was really necessary. 3 bunk beds, 2 probably sleeping while 1 was up. We don't know the exact facts. All these are the things, overcoat, gas masks, just to show you the kind of tools they would have needed. A loo, fire extinguisher, and very important, these buckets and stirrup pump. Now a lot of people think, not very good for putting a fire out, but they were never intended to put a fire out. They were intended to put incendiary bombs out. They're very little bombs that used to drop, do no damage whatsoever. Then they realised by squirting water on these incendiary devices was causing greater concern, because that's what it was waiting for. Water or rain to come on them, which would have ignited them. So we also have a sand bucket. Now that was even better. There's a shovel that you could have covered the incendiary device with, a shovel, and this is a unique tool. An incendiary device, had it started to go off, I don't know the exact combination of what chemicals it had in, but this chemical reacted to water, and it really did glow red hot. It would melt things, set fire to buildings. So say for example, if a bomber had flew over and dropped incendiary devices and they'd landed on, say, buildings in Manchester, nobody would have been aware of that had it been a nice dry night when they were dropped. But 2 or 3 days later, when rain came, or if a building was on fire next door and the fire brigade were putting the fire out with water and it went onto the building next door, it would actually trigger off a fire in the building next door. So sand was the way to deal with it, and this was the implement for picking them up. You couldn't obviously pick them up with your hand, so it's not working very well at the moment, but it's like a claw. And what you actually do, you open it, use your foot on the lever, and it clips onto it, and then obviously the bomb is then disposed of. And I believe history shows that the people in Stockport were very, very, very good at removing these incendiaries that was dropped. One of the reasons that Stockport didn't get quite a lot of bombing that they would have done normally. Very, very vigilant people here, but unfortunately Manchester were the target. So I can't say they weren't vigilant, I can say that they were just the main target, so they didn't have a great deal of choice. But luckily they did come down and stayed here with us. Right, this part is showing you the kind of tools that the men who actually dug the tunnels, dug them in 12 months, all by hand, everything wheelbarrowed out, all the sandstone had to go to the main entrance as instructed, to be carried away on lorries. Main reason they wanted the sand for sandbags for anti-blast purposes, but also the foundries for smelting. So came very useful. One drilling, and if you notice he's got a pneumatic drill, that's one that's worked off an air line. One shoveling and 4 barrowing, and I think there was 4 groups of 6 men. So 24 men to dig this complex out. Absolutely amazing feat of engineering as far as I'm concerned. And it wasn't just a matter of digging a tunnel. You've got tunnels leading off tunnels, and if you take the centre section, 19 cross tunnels. Doing that by hand and wheelbarrowing it as well, I can't say too much more about it. Right, gentlemen, this is the first aid post. This was built as part of the complex, very basic, covered obviously for hygienic purposes, the old bits of sand dropping in everywhere. The basic things that they needed. The wireless was there obviously to keep an eye on what was happening up top, the news and things like that. This photograph, which I think you might be able to pick up on your camera, 2 nurses, and not a doctor, but a chemist, but had the ability to treat things that were necessary. A doctor would have been brought down had there been an emergency, but obviously very scarce because of what was happening in the hospitals and up top. These 2 nurses used to come down as an air raid was sounded, come down, generally look after people. When the air raid or the all clear went, then they returned back to the infirmary. This lad used to do quite a few hours down here. So you were looked after as best they could offer. Things like if your children were running around, which they would do, and this would be heaven to them. Fall over, bang their head, they need the odd plaster. Ladies suffering from anxiety, is my husband going to be alright? Are the kids going to be alright? Is my house going to be there when I get out? Obviously would get a headache, no doubt. Aspirin. So the basic needs that they needed. 1 or 2 things that weren't around was a lady, you don't mind me telling the story about the lady who had her child down here, 1940, 1 baby born down here, but there was nothing really laid on for ladies who were going to have children. He was born here in 1940, we know he's living in Australia, desperately trying to seek him. We would like a copy of his birth certificate. Does it say Stockport or does it say air raid shelters? If it said air raid shelters, what a find for us. However, this was here. These tunnels were built at a later stage because what had actually happened, they didn't realise that people coming in here close proximity, you would get things like nits, fleas, head lice, measles, chicken pox, everything. So they dug a tunnel very quickly and made the isolating ward. Then when this lady had her baby, they realised that 1 or 2 women might also have babies during the war years down here. So they dug another tunnel and we got the nursing mothers section, which is also partly on the right hand side as well. Right, come in and see the luxury toilets, I call them, and the reason I call them that, as a child our toilet was at the end of the yard. One of the reasons I didn't like visiting in the middle of the night, getting a candle and going down. So this really would have amazed me. Our toilet was on a septic tank. These, actually you can flush them by pulling the chain. Nice water box, door on, lovely wooden seat. This was because they really did need that little bit of extra hygiene because of them looking after people's health. So the nurses' toilets really did have to be upmarket, which you'll see when you go to the public ones in a minute. Right, gents, welcome to the toilets, or should I say the public toilets. Very basic, but having said that, as a child I would have been very, very impressed drain pipe upside down, little partitions. Now a lot of them have gone, not because they've gone over the years, but we've left one in that is the original, and of course we then copied from that original and put some back. Very impressive toilet paper, one you could sit there and read and then use later. One of the jobs that children were given this, to stop them being bored, tearing little squares up. Then your parents would put a hole through and a piece of string. This is what I like. Flush by the warden every so often, so you didn't need to flush your own toilet. But until the warden come, I don't think there would have been not many people would want to visit, and this has got to be the best. History tells us, or people who have used these during the war, the curtains, have you noticed in the nurses' toilets, doors with the catch on? Well, apparently there's a citation somewhere that doors must not be put on the public ones. Curtains must be put on. Things will go on behind closed doors that wouldn't otherwise. I'd just leave that entirely at your discretion. Did they not realise that it was women and children coming down here? So the very, very basic things. Toilets. Right, this is the Anderson shelter. The reason we've got it in here is so the children can actually see it. It would be actually buried under the ground, so you'd just see the top half of it. You went down in steps. Now the reason I remember this is the one that I first visited, I'll remember visiting when I was 6. Went down into it, but unfortunately my mother wouldn't let me go into it because it was completely filled with water and sewage. So we, for the duration of the war, had been sleeping under the staircase. One of the safest places, if you see a house bombed, you invariably always saw the stairs still standing. So I think women got the idea. And anyway, towards the end, my mum didn't give a care in the end. She just took her chances. But we wouldn't go in this because it had filled up. As you said, come out of our house, the Anderson shelter was under the ground, with just the top. You walked round it, and at the end of the yard was the toilet on a septic tank. And because it was higher than the shelter, when the rain came, though it didn't completely flood it, seepage got out and went into the bottom of the shelter, and it filled up with water and sewage, so we didn't go in there. Very, very safe, would withstand anything other than an actual direct hit. There is a case in Edgeley that a bomb fell very close by one, and there was such a blast that the house it had hit had completely disintegrated, but the people in the shelter had only just got in there by sheer luck, and they were okay. In fact, the blast was so bad that the bike from next door and the lawnmower had ended up on the roof of the house that side. I was going to throw a joke in there, is this where the first fly mold come from, but I don't think I'll bother. Anyway, these photographs on the wall, there was the Anderson shelter, there was the average brick shelter that were public. Some, like next door to us, had a brick one, then every alternate house had an Anderson shelter. This is probably the one that was like the most, or I thought until I spoke to people. The Morrison shelter was inside your house, it was a metal cage, you could go in, and if your house did get collapsed through a bomb next door, you were quite safe. Now that's fine. People have told me if you live in the rural areas where there are about 7 or 8 houses and a bomb just gets left or something happens, people will come and rescue you after a couple of days. But if you lived in the middle of the Manchester Blitz, can you imagine being in one of these with a whole house of rubble on top of you and maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the emergency services can get to you? So a lot of people who have been down here said they got the nickname the coffin. I can't quantify this, but that's what they call them. And another story that comes from the public, I never knew the top of the brick shelter was so heavy, it was made of concrete, that it was never really fixed down. It was just rested on top because it was so heavy it would stay in position. And if a blast came nearby, the roof would lift slightly. stopping the building collapsing? Is this where the saying raising the roof comes from? We don't know, but we do find these things out bit by bit. Maybe somebody can help with them. So the Anderson shelter, very, very safe shelter indeed. Saved a lot of lives, I presume, over the duration of the war.
And this wonderful picture, electricians testing an air raid warning siren on the roof of a Manchester store in readiness for the test signals today. On the 27th of September, the emergency war budget was introduced, petrol rationing being first. Food rationing came 4 months later. The weekly allowance for a family was 2 ounces of tea, 2 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of margarine, 4 ounces of sugar, 2 ounces of sweets, and 2 ounces of fats. Dig for victory. As food supplies became short, everybody was encouraged to grow as much vegetables and fruit as possible. Schools took over spare land for crops, and the Women's Land Army was introduced. By the end of the war, 59,000 women were working on the land. Some 30,000 said they wanted to stay on. Some did. Agricultural and food production was vital to the war effort. And the Women's Land Army was formed to help farmers because many of their workers were away fighting. And this Ministry of Agriculture Dig for Victory poster. It says Dig for Victory exhibition at the Central Library, Manchester, 2nd to the 19th of March, 1943, official opening by the Duke of Norfolk. Admission free. Dig for Victory. And here we see railings being removed for scrap. Most of the scrap wasn't in fact used and was dumped into the sea later. It was mainly a public relations exercise. The phony war ended with the German invasion of the Low Countries, and everyone started saying, what if the Germans try a similar thing here? On Tuesday the 14th of May 1940, the Secretary of State for War decided to start a new force. It would be called the Local Defence Volunteers. They were originally known as Look, Duck and Vanish, but that was soon to change. In the early months of 1942, the Home Guard was asked to form anti-aircraft batteries, initially to crew anti-aircraft rocket sites. At the beginning of 1943, the Home Guard began to take over batteries equipped with 40mm Bofors guns, or 3.7-inch or 4.5-inch heavy guns. Manning these heavy guns was physically demanding work, and soon no one over the age of 40 was accepted. Here we have a picture of the King and Queen visiting an ARP station in Manchester. Although in the mid-1920s a committee for imperial defence first took an interest in air raid precautions, Manchester's ARP plan was accepted by the Home Office in the middle of August 1938. There was unfortunately no provision for public air raid shelters, no early warning system for air raids, and plans for a command and coordination of firefighting cover still had to be worked out. Air raid precautions also, of course, involved balloons, anti-aircraft guns, searchlights and smoke screens. And of course on the top of many, many buildings, spotters were put up there to watch for German raiders coming over the city. It was at 1:34 a.m. on the morning of the 20th of June 1940 when Manchester experienced its first of 329 serious air raid alerts. Thankfully, it was a false alarm. The first bombs didn't fall until the 29th of July when a stray bomber dumped its payload in the Oddsall Lane area of Salford. The next incident occurred on the 8th of August when the city was leaflet raided. The Luftwaffe was dropping Hitler's last appeal to reason. One bundle failed to open and fell on the head of a policeman guarding the entrance to Salford City Civil Defence Report and Control Centre. Christmas tree candles were flickering behind shuttered windows in thousands of homes when the first stick of bombs blasted into Manchester on that fateful night of December the 22nd, 1940. At 6:37, the air raid sirens wailed their ominous warning. Within 2 minutes, Luftwaffe incendiaries were raining on and around Albert Square, the city's almost defenceless. Later came high explosive bombs and landmines. By 6:24 next morning, when the all clear was sounded, a large part of the city centre was rubble. Fires were rampaging through scores of buildings, and many Mancunians were dead or injured. Within 2 hours of the alert, 560 fires had been started, 105 of them serious and beyond control. The moaning Minis wailed again at 7:12 on December the 23rd. Manchester was virtually defenceless again. The RAF were helpless at night, and if the anti-aircraft guns did hit any of the 441 Luftwaffe raiders on the 2 nights, it was only by pure chance. By 1:23 next morning, when the all clear sounded, 37,150 incendiary bombs had rained on Manchester, 1,077 high explosive bombs, 95 landmines and 170 flares. The 18 hours of German bombardment killed 576 people and left more than 1,800 injured. The Christmas Blitz, which devastated Manchester, Salford and parts of Stretford and Altrincham, caused the biggest blaze ever witnessed in England since the Great Fire of London in 1666. And nothing was sacred. They even bombed Old Trafford. And here's a picture of the football ground while it was being rebuilt. And this rather humorous photograph here of the cricket ground. It says, "No play, bad ground." And another blackboard which states, "Next game, Lancs v Jerry." And look at this panoramic view of the city, with the static water tanks for the fire brigade, the ruins of Parker Street, camouflaged buses and the surface air raid shelters in Piccadilly.
Here on parade, swinging to the march of the National Fire Service, are the firemen and firewomen from Manchester, Liverpool, Merseyside and the towns of the Northwest region. Proud of the force in which they serve, they are all worthy to take their place in the front line beside the other great services of the Crown. Many of us remember the days of 1940 and 41 when the Luftwaffe nightly visited our cities and towns, leaving fire and destruction behind. In quieter times, we're apt to forget these firemen and firewomen, then handicapped by inadequate water supplies and lack of standard equipment, who fought and won the first great battle of the war, the Battle of the Plains. They fought not only the fires in their own towns, but often rushed to the assistance of their comrades in other parts of the country. Many were part-timers, who responded to the siren's call after a day's work in our vital factories, offices and shops. Battle of the Flames taught us the necessity for a national organization with standard training and standard equipment. The 1,400 fire brigades were welded into one whole. Thus was born the National Fire Service. All personnel undergo training at schools in each fire force area. The quick and accurate handling of equipment is practiced. It is necessary to have a thorough knowledge of all the various firefighting appliances. The service demands a high standard of technical efficiency and knowledge. It is an essential part of the training of both men and women that the science and tactics of firefighting should be discussed, planned, and learned. Women are trained for control room work, so that full use can be made of every available man for firefighting. Senior officers give trainees the benefit of their long experience. To be fit to fight fires, all personnel must be fighting fit. Fitness training forms an important part of the daily routine on all fire stations. The service is always in the front line and must be ready. A bitter lesson was learned during the blitzes when water mains were fractured and water supplies, the ammunition of the firemen, failed. So now many miles of pipelines have been laid in our cities, and these can be easily repaired to ensure an adequate supply of water to strategic points. Emergency tanks are kept filled, and an organization exists for relaying water to them from all available supplies. Unfortunately, irresponsible people have thought these tanks make good rubbish dumps for everything from stones and iron bedsteads to perambulators. NFS instructors visit schools and give warning that the tanks are a danger to children. Where it is not possible to use steel pipelines, special appliances are used which can lay twin lines of hose at 20 miles an hour. Pressure of water is maintained for long distances by pumps placed at various points along the whole course of the relay. The service has its own stores department, a vast organization handling large stocks of equipment, uniforms, and accessories. The department is run with an eye to efficiency and economy. Replacements are only made on the certificate of an officer, and they must be rarely necessary. The tailor shop is always busy. The principle is make do and mend. And this also goes for the bootmaker shop. On the administrative side, a staff of efficient women are employed to relieve men for more active firefighting duties. In every town, arrangements are made for incoming reinforcements to be sent from other parts of the country. Wherever the enemy attacks, immediate reinforcements are sent to the assistance of that town. Here they are checked in and arrangements are made for their billeting and feeding. Hot meals are prepared and can be sent out to men engaged on actual firefighting operations. Engineering shops have been equipped to ensure that the repairs and maintenance of equipment are carried out speedily and efficiently. These workshops are staffed by firemen who are qualified mechanics. Mobile workshops and up-to-date machinery make periodical visits to all stations. Firemen, skilled building operatives in their peacetime occupation, working under the direction of architects and surveyors, have rebuilt and adapted fire stations. During their standby periods, firemen and firewomen employ their time usefully and skillfully in making toys for children in hospitals and day nurseries. This work is quite voluntary, and the only recompense is the satisfaction of giving happiness to the... Miniature munition factories have been established at some of the stations. Here, propeller blades are being polished. At another station, old tires are retreaded. Pay is at the recognized rates, but one half goes to the exchequer and the other half to the welfare fund of the service. Although working, the men are always available for a fire call. Firewoman on duty taking a call. From the constant record of appliances available, they order out the first attendants. In this work, under blitz conditions, the women have proved their worth. The appliances arrive at the fire. The situation is quickly surveyed by the officer in charge, who then gives his orders to the crews on the appliances. The first thing to discover is whether lives are in danger. It requires a high degree of courage to stand on a 100-foot ladder over a fire. Fireboats are sent for as they are most useful on the dock side and at ship fires. Their powerful jets save the work of a large number of men. Fires on ships are most dangerous, but to trained firefighters, difficulties are but a challenge to their determination and skill. Their job is to prevent the fire from spreading. It's a hot and smoky job in the hold of a cargo ship. These men and women in the northwest of England, with their fire guard comrades, are ready to see that uncontrolled fires do not again ravage our cities and the homes of our fighting men. Fireman's life is a dangerous one, both in peace and under blitz conditions. This film is dedicated to those who have given their lives and who have been injured fighting the battle of the flames.
There was an intense patriotic fervour in Manchester at the start of the war. When Lord Beaverbrook appealed to the nation to help sponsor aircraft, the boss of the Hume engineering firm of Bertram Thomas chipped in £5,000. Thousands of Mancunians followed suit, and the city of Manchester bought 10 Spitfires for the nation. The industrial might of Manchester and the surrounding area played a vital part in the nation's war effort. Hundreds of firms, large and small alike, were called upon to divert much of their capacity to meeting the emergency to such an extent that in individual companies it accounted for anything up to 95% of their output. On the 22nd of October 1939, the Ford Motor Company was asked to create shadow factories to build Rolls-Royce Merlin engines at Trafford Park. The total engines built by that factory amounted to 30,428. In 1934, Metro Vickers, one of the leading firms on Trafford Park, was manufacturing signal equipment, then radar equipment, 18-pound field guns and 4.5-inch anti-aircraft guns. In 1938, with A.V. Rowan Company, commonly known as Avro, they created a heavy bomber, aptly named the Manchester. The first airframe was completed on November 1940. That's when disaster struck. Trafford Park was blitzed on December the 23rd. The completed aircraft, with 12 others under construction, was destroyed. But undaunted, they started again. Manufacture of the Manchester lasted until May 1941, when production was switched to the Lancaster, and then in 1943 to the Lincoln. This bomber is hailed as the plane that won the war, and it bore a label, Made in Manchester. And here we have an aerial view of Ringway Control Tower and former air terminal during the war, with a variety of aircraft on the grass. Britain's first airborne forces trained in large numbers at Manchester Airport during the Second World War. Converted Whitley bombers were used for early parachute training. And here we see a Whitley bomber dropping parachutists over Cheshire. Hardly looks high enough to me. And this picture, Flight Lieutenant F.G. Gray, Adjutant, Centre, briefing pilots of number 613, City of Manchester Squadron, Royal Auxiliary Air Force, before they left Ringway Airport for training exercise at Horsham St Faith, near Norwich. And another picture here, paratroopers training at Ringway, May the 8th, 1941. The Manchester Ship Canal was considered so important that it was named by Goering as a prime target, when in November 1940 he issued a new directive to the Luftwaffe to commence economic war against Britain. Manchester and Salford docks were important centres for the import of grain and general cargo, but added to these were increasing loads of American and Canadian-built military equipment during the build-up to D-Day. Among the exports from the docks were a number of mobile power stations built by Metrovic for the Soviet Union. Associated with the docks was a gantry, several hundred yards long, built to allow the direct loading of Pluto pipeline in a continuous length from Glover and Company to vessels moored at Trafford Wharf. After Pearl Harbor, American GIs and airmen started arriving over here, armed with nylons, candy bars and a Hollywood drawl that set the Manchester girls swooning. 18,500 GIs were based at Burton Wood near Warrington. It was in fact the largest US base in Europe. Many legendary American performers entertained the troops at Burton Wood, including Nat King Cole, Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and of course legendary trombonist and the king of swing, Glenn Miller. And another scene from Burton Wood, a pretty girl cracks a bottle of bubbly on the gun turret of a B-17 bomber at Burton Wood. This airfield played a major role in the Allied war over Europe. Hundreds of US bombers and fighters were processed through this unit on their way to frontline stations. For nearly 6 long years, Manchester had dreamed of Hitler's defeat, and now the greatest war in history was over. It was Tuesday, May the 8th, 1945, and thousands of joyous Mancunians were gathered in Albert Square at 3 o'clock to hear the Prime Minister's historic radio broadcast from number 10. From 2 p.m. they had listened happily to the police band, waving and cheering madly. Then the crowd hushed as the band ceased, and Winston Churchill's fervent voice rang with an echo through the square, ending with the words, "Advance Britannia, long live the cause of freedom, God save the King." When he finished, the cheering erupted again and again as the Union Jack was broken on the main flagpole. A mighty peal from the Town Hall bells, and the Lord Mayor, Alderman W.P. Jackson, spoke from the Town Hall steps. But the biggest cheer of all was reserved for a siren, sounding what was hoped was the last all clear in Manchester.